Welcome everyone to week 3 of 6 of reading Plato. It's the 21st of September, and I guess I've got a few items before we get started. The video recording from last week, I don't know if anyone had a chance to look at it or if anyone went back to catch up, but the video quality was very poor because the internet at my house was very poor. So if you are trying to go back and catch up, there is another video that was recorded on Wednesday night, the same reading with a different group. So if you need that recording, you can message me or Bernie or put a message in the chat, in this Zoom chat, and I can send you the link. And we've got some new classes coming up in November. These will be our twilight classes after these spring classes. And we're going to be running this same introductory class again, as well as Platonism and Christianity. And that one, the Platonism and Christianity, is going to start on the 9th of November. And the reading Plato is going to start on the 10th of November. And we're just letting you know early in case you have any friends that want to join, or if you yourself want to take the Christian Platonism one, because the earlier the better. We've been having some trouble with the virus and the posting times of books getting to people a bit late. So yeah, the earlier the better. And this new course, the Christian Platonism course, is usually we have the introductory course, and then after you do the introductory course, you can do any of our other courses. But this one, Christian Platonism, is sort of open to the public. So whoever wants to join can join that one. So if you think you have any friends that might want to do that one, let them know. And all that information will be available on the Platonic Academy website, which is platonicacademy.com.au. That's all the notes. Let's see. Yeah, that's all. Bernie.
Okay, thanks, David. So yeah, that Platonism and Christianity, it's talking about the influence of Platonism on early Christianity, some of which we'll come to address a little bit today. Actually, you can't book it at the moment. I haven't got the information up on the website today, but I did a little bit of work on it, and I think David and I are doing a bit of work on it, and I think we'll have it probably up tomorrow, so you'll be able to see what's happening with that one there. Okay, now I'm getting a little bit of static, so maybe while I'm having a bit of a spiel, maybe people could just put their mute on. Yeah, that worked, whoever that was. Great. Okay, so today we'll do a little bit of revision again, and we'll talk about, the key points that we've brought up already: skepticism, wisdom, the theory of forms stuff. But I'll start with a final reflection on our exercise with the cup, because it kind of leads into what we're doing today. It's not entirely lateral to what we're doing. Things will start coming together hopefully today. So just a reminder that everything I know about the cup is in my senses. My sense of touch, my sense of sight, my sense of hearing, and so on. And all my senses are actually in me. So there's nothing I know of the cup that is beyond my senses. Everything that seems like it's beyond my senses is actually in my senses. Now, the cup is a construction from this sensible knowledge in my mind, in me. So this conclusion here is that all my experience, my entire sensible world, is in me. Now, most philosophy gets to this point, which is sometimes called the mind-body problem. Where we go from here is what matters. It's good to get a clear picture of the problem before jumping to a solution. So what happens here is that I start with the naive view that the sensible object, the cup, is immediately known but independent. I know it immediately. It's there, it's real, it's present, but it's independent from me. Then on reflection, I find that my knowledge of it and its being is entirely within me. It's independent from me, and yet it's in me. It doesn't make sense. So that's where the doubt comes in. And in Platonism, it's very important to begin by being skeptical of culturally accepted ways of thinking and ways of seeing, to question them and to introduce doubt. Platonic philosophy starts with skepticism of it starts with the skepticism that's called Socratic skepticism. Now, we came across this mentioned, referred to in the Apology, and then it was exemplified in Euthyphro last week. Socrates' question and answers inquiry is used to find contradictions and circular arguments in apparently reasonable and well-founded views. Skepticism clears away the illusions of foundation in habitual ways of thinking. Now today, from this skepticism, we're going to start to build Plato's alternative way of seeing. We'll start to turn around to look up rather than look down. But it does take some time to see what Plato is saying. So that's the skepticism, and now we're moving to wisdom, the positive side of things. And so, as we recall, that what Plato calls his practice, or the goal of his practice, philosophy, we'll remember that philo means love and Sophia means wisdom. So it's love of wisdom. But what is wisdom? Plato's view is that true wisdom is divine. What can we take this divine to mean? So it's important to see, and I think we've already seen it, that in Plato's context of the gods of Greece and everything, he's pushing beyond a crude popular stories of the traditional gods for a more pure, if you like, high church notion of divinity. Wisdom and its objects, the ideal forms, have the higher characteristics of the divine. So these objects are, the objects of wisdom are insensible, outside time, unchanging, and yet somehow actively present in our world. So the next question is, if they're divine, how do us mere humans have access to this wisdom? The answer is by inspiration or enthusiasm. Enthusiasm literally means being filled with God, having God within. This is how wisdom is received, and it can be compared with the Christian notion of revelation. Wisdom is not something that you work out by reasoning, although reasoning can help. And once you know it, you can give an account of it and persuade others towards it. The mystical cults had their own method of enlightenment through a progression of rites and practices. And remember, the mystical cults came before Plato and influenced Plato. But Plato's way of enlightenment was through discussion. He calls it dialectic, through reason, the logos, as well as old-fashioned myth or mythos. So wisdom is an envisaging or an insight. Wisdom can be difficult to distinguish from madness, just as it is difficult to distinguish divine madness of the oracles or prophets from ordinary delusional madness. It's hard to tell which is which. There is no settling with proof or by finding falsehood through contradiction. It's not logical in that sense. Okay, so that's skepticism, that's wisdom. And now specifically with the wisdom, we were getting into last week the theory of forms. Now remember we discussed the idea of justice. The ideal of justice is hard to define, yet we all seem to somehow have a sense of it. We fall back on it as soon as someone starts discussing justice in any particular situation. Where does this idea of justice come from? Now remember I said the essence of things is like the essence of number. But what is the essence of number? What is the essence? Remember, we use the example of the number 2. We can have 2 things, 2 anything, 2 ideas, 2 of anything you can imagine. So 2's always there in all those 2 things. But what is 2 and where does it exist? So that's kind of like a way into imagining what the forms are like. And that's as far as we got with Platonic formalism last week. So there's more to come this week and in the next 4 weeks. Okay. Well, maybe I'll stop for questions there. Why not? Any questions before we get into the Phaedo itself? Gwyneth, you'll need to turn your speaker mic on.
Yeah, seemed to be a sharp demarcation between body and soul. What does he mean by soul?
Look, that's a great question for today. And maybe can I hold off on that until we get to it in today's reading? Because it's a very important question. And yeah, like there's certainly a translation issue there as well. So yeah, I'll get to that, Gwen. Anyone else?
Yeah.
No? Okay. No one else? Okay, well, if you've got any questions, you can put it in the comments or ask me later if something comes up. All right, so let's go to this new dialogue. So far we've been looking at mostly at Socratic skepticism. Now we move to a more affirmative philosophy. From this week, we'll be reading the Phaedo, which is one of Plato's most important, most influential dialogues. It's perhaps more influential than famous these days. Not many people know about it or read it. While the discussion will focus on the reading, I'd like to take you through the entire text. So in between the reading will move through the entire dialogue, leaving some gaps. So I will fill you in with what happens in between. Now, this week, there's not much that happens before our first reading, but there is this framing narrative. And you get this in a lot of Plato's dialogues, where you have someone recounting the conversation that happened between maybe Socrates and some other people a long time ago. Sometimes there is a narrative within a narrative, and sometimes there's a narrative within a narrative within a narrative. In this case, an acolyte of Socrates, Phaedo, is asked to recount the discussion between Socrates and his gathered friends in prison on Socrates' last day. So it's dawn in the prison on the last day, the last possible discussion with Socrates ever. So there's that intensity about it. Socrates could have escaped, but chose not to. We hear this in Crito, which is the dialogue prior to Socrates in this chronology and in your collection. So you can have a look at that, where Socrates had an opportunity, they'd set it all up, they had the boat ready, he could have just escaped, they'd paid off the guards, he could have escaped, but he chose not to. And we'll have a look today about why, one of the reasons why he might have chosen not to. So in the audience in the prison, and also in the audience in the framing dialogue, there are some interesting characters which are worth going through. So firstly, there's a significant contingent of Pythagoreans. Now, remember I said the Pythagoreans were the people who introduced in the 5th century, a couple of generations before Plato, this mathematical approach to philosophy, almost like a mathematical religion or theology. So in the framing narrative, we have the man Echecrates is a Pythagorean. And then in the prison cell scene itself, we've got, doing most of the discussion with Socrates is Cebius and Simmias, who are both, we're told, students of Philolaus, who perhaps was the very founder of the mathematical approach to philosophy that was then taken up in Plato's academy. So also in the prison is the founder of the Cynics, Artisthenes, whose base, we don't know much about his teaching, but basically that he taught that it's good to be virtuous, live according to nature, and live in poverty. And then the following Cynics were quite famous for this living in a very impoverished, basic way. We also have Euclides of Megara. Now, the Megarans were skeptics and followers of the earlier Parmenides and Zeno. So Parmenides is probably the most famous skeptic, and Zeno was his follower. You might have heard of Zeno's paradoxes. Anyway, the Megarians will feature in other dialogues of Plato where they lead the discussion in the Sophist on Parmenides. So interestingly, in Plato's works, most of the leaders of the dialogues are skeptics. And then we hear right down the end, this isn't quite in the reading, he just mentions, oh, Plato was sick that day. So that's why Plato wasn't there. So Plato is kind of always this shadow in the background. So when you go through all those, when you think about all those people that are mentioned, it's kind of like a Last Supper. There's key representatives from the main schools of philosophy respected by Plato. Okay, and so our reading today opens with Socrates removing the manacles, and oh, he gets this rush of pleasure. And that starts the discussion of pleasure and pain, and how he says, isn't it strange how one follows the other? They don't come together at the same time, but where there's one, there's always the other not so far behind. So pleasure can follow pain, but also pleasure can be pleasure can be followed by pain. So it's this suggestion that we will see later that, you know, like if you pursue pleasure, it's hard to get endless pleasure. Undoubtedly, pain will follow along soon enough. So in general, this introduced the theme of opposites, which is a theme throughout this dialogue, but also throughout Platonism generally. Oh, sorry, Plato's works generally. Okay, so then there's this question that's passed from the poet, Evenus. Why has Socrates recently taken up writing poetry? So Socrates explains, well, I've had this recurring dream instructing me to practice and cultivate the arts. Now the word here, the Greek word is actually the word we get music from, so musiki. And this has an interesting broad and narrow meaning. So the narrow meaning is music, but especially rhyming poetry, which was considered music. So Homer's works is considered music. And musaka, in the broader sense, literally means of the muses. And so it had this broader meaning of the arts in general. So according to the broader meaning, Socrates interpreted initially the direction of the dream to be saying, well, do philosophy, keep doing what you're doing, encouraging him because philosophy is the highest art, the highest form of music. This explanation affects a segue to the major theme in the dialogue, where Socrates closes with his message to Evenas by saying his farewells, I'm going today, farewell, and then encourage him to follow as quickly as he can. What does Socrates mean that Evenas should follow him as quickly as he can? At first glance, it looks something like a suicide cult, that Socrates is suggesting that after he dies, Evenas should top himself. And in his defense, this is a bit surprising to his audience, and in his defense, Socrates says, but isn't Evenas a philosopher? And he suggests that he's only reiterating the Pythagorean teaching. Now remember, Cebes and Simmias were students of Philolaus, the Pythagorean. And also it's helpful to note here that there's very strong associations between the cult of Pythagoras and the mystery cult of Orpheus, and we can come to that later. Anyway, there's another reference to secret doctrines of the mysteries where he says, well, there is that secret doctrine that our current life is a prison. But escaping by suicide is wrong because it disrespects the gods who are our guardians and keepers. We need to wait for a benefactor, like the state of Athens in the case of Socrates. So it's like, oh, lucky Socrates, Athens is doing a good thing for him by killing him. So it's kind of getting rather morbid. So philosophers should not commit suicide, yet be ready and willing to die. And here Simmias puts in a plea, oh, but don't leave us, Socrates. So this is when we start moving into the discussion of body and soul. Socrates says, I'm going to gods who are also good masters. Socrates will be with gods and better people. There is a suggestion even of reward and punishment in the afterlife. So what does it mean that to study philosophy is to study nothing but dying and being dead? All agree that death is the release of the soul from the body, and that the life after death is the life of the soul. Pursuit of philosophy is to renounce bodily pleasures. Indeed, philosophers despise the body. One who cares nothing for the body is as good as dead. Philosophers are half dead already. Philosophy is a preparation for dying and death. Death is a release from the pursuit of bodily pleasures and bodily adornments, which is what the philosopher desires. The philosopher's soul is disdainful of the body. The philosopher wishes to be free from its change, free from the slavery to the body. This is why the true philosopher makes dying his profession. So it's surprisingly morbid. There should be one of those mental health warnings like they have on television saying, you know, you can call this number. But the weirder thing about it is that Socrates is so playful and so cheerful as he's giving out this advice. There's also an interesting kind of side bit here where there's a discussion of beloved, using the analogy of the lover and beloved. It's about on page 68A, where the lover beloved becomes a theme through Platonism. And actually, we've got another group studying the symposium at the moment where it is a major theme of the symposium. And it goes on through Islamic Platonism and into Sufism. So just as the beloved wife or son, just as when the beloved wife or son dies, the lover wants to die too, to be with them in the other world. And likewise, the lover of wisdom wants to die to be with his beloved Sophia, or wisdom. So the philosopher aims to purify himself by the body of the body until the divine offers deliverance in death. In his aim to acquire wisdom, the physical body is a distraction. Moreover, we all agree that hearing and seeing are not accurate, and this is his segue to discussing the theory of forms. So, the philosopher is reaching out towards the reality of the forms, like the form of justice, which we discussed last week. Also, absolute beauty and absolute goodness. We never see the absolute with our own eyes. It's unseen, altogether insensible. There follows a declaration that philosophy is to pursue the essence and underlying quality of everything. The essence and underlying quality of everything. So the philosopher looks towards the real nature of any given thing. What it actually is, its essence and underlying quality. So notice now that we're moving not just to the forms of these highfalutin ideals like justice or beauty or good, but the essence of every darn thing. To get there, one must meditate on reality alone without the senses. It's like a retreat through meditation away from the body and the sensible world. To understand the essential being of all things, you must go away from the realm of sensible things and into this formal realm. He says, we must be free from the body and must behold the actual realities with the eye of the soul alone. Arising to truth is a purification of the soul. The practice of philosophy is the soul fully detaching itself from the physical body so that it is ready for an easy transition to the afterlife of the soul. And he mentions here, he's careful to distinguish ordinary virtue from true virtue, where he talks about ordinary virtue as being based in fear of missing out on another pleasure, like fear of missing out on a reward in the afterlife, if you like. This is not true virtue. True virtue gives attention to these higher truths. So, in conclusion, the philosopher's soul prepares for death by detaching itself from bodily concerns and passions. Instead, she focuses on the insensible forms or the essence of all being. If the philosopher does this well, then if the philosopher's soul does this well, then she is well prepared for the afterlife. So that's the Phaedo so far, and I'd be really interested in your impressions. So any questions or comments or things that came up? I can talk about the soul, if you like, Gwyneth, now. Maybe I can start with that. Yeah, okay. So the word for soul is, I say psyche, psyche is the Greek word, but it actually is the origin of our word psyche, as in psychology. And in some ways, it might be a better term to use. I prefer to use it mostly. Now, psyche comes from, it does have an original meaning which suggests breath, and if you like, the breath of life. So animated life is considered to have psyche. So it's sort of like living or animation. In Latin, it was translated as anima. Now, in the ancient legends, in Homer and so forth, psyche isn't portrayed as something that you actually have when you're living. It's actually the spirit or the breath, if you like, that leaves the body when the body dies. But in the 5th century, there seemed to be a new understanding or a new idea of psyche. And it seems to have come through the mystery cults and through Pythagoreanism. But it's certainly there in Plato. And it's this idea in Plato where it is closer to starting to mean, if you like, consciousness or the mind. And it still relates to animated life. And we'll see that when we start discussing reincarnation and the movement of souls through humans and other animals. So that's psyche or psyche, which is translated entirely through the Christian tradition as soul or anima in Latin. Okay. Any comments about that? David, did you have anything to add?
I find the Phaedo one of the more difficult texts in this collection of readings. I don't know how everyone else feels about it, especially because it's very... I haven't done the reading this week, but I've read the whole thing before, and I find that it's more just Socrates asserting things rather than proving them in any way, which is kind of the fun thing because you're like listening to a conversation or someone talking or a dialogue, but there's not the logically laid out step by step, this is why this is the case. So I don't know if that's, I don't know, what do other people think about that?
Can I say something? I think if we go with human nature, so this is someone's interpretation of what Socrates said, but potentially in that moment, it is comforting for him to be certain about what he says, because sure, he's trying to convince others, but it's also a comfort in believing that that is so, and he doesn't need to investigate any further because he hasn't got the time for it.
Yeah, look, that's a really important point, and this will come out through the dialogue. I mean, it's so many different levels, and thank you for bringing it up. Socrates has a vested interest in the drama of this dialogue, in the outcome, because they then move into a debate about and give different reasons and proofs, if you like, for the immortality of the soul. And Socrates has a vested interest in the outcome, of course, because he's facing his death, and it would be nice to know that this is what was going to happen after death. And there's this kind of tension between mythology about this, where he says, perhaps it's like this, or you hope it's like this, or it might be like this, and actually showing some proof is the way it's translated, but be careful with that word, some proof that in fact there is an afterlife and that things might happen in the afterlife. So this Samila's pointing out a very important dynamic that's going on in the narrative about that is happening because it is a play, because it is this fictional performance. Yeah.
I wanted to ask something about Socrates. He doesn't mention his wife a lot when he's talking about how accepting he is of death. Is that sort of to prove the point that, you know, the soul is more important than the bodily kind of, you know, physical attachments?
Well, it's a big question. Another big question. It's got a. The first thing is to talk about the culture at the time, and that you know, again, if we go to symposium, which another group is doing tomorrow night, it's really apparent that it's a very homoerotic scene. And marriage, a girl was married just after she reached puberty, and the talk of love in these discussions amongst the men has very rarely discusses love of women. The love is mostly of younger boys, boys, just post-pubescent boys. And there's a real culture around that. And so Socrates, in the dialogues, Socrates himself and lots of other people talk of their love and affection of beautiful boys. So, so the love culture's all around that. And yeah, so not a lot of discussion and of love of the wife. And there was a rare discussion of it there. But then there's also that thing, oh, send the women away, you know, because they're sobbing. I think that comes up in this dialogue, or, oh, sorry, in this section, or at least maybe in prior to that. Maybe I excise that out. So it is actually very difficult. And I am aware, you know, that I'm a male, and here we've got mostly women in the audience. And it's very difficult to deal with, I think. It's very, difficult to deal with this cultural difference. Yeah, anyone else want to reflect on how they feel about reading? Oh yeah, go on, Libby.
So women didn't count in this society. They were useful for producing children, but they were seen as being subhuman, basically. A bit like slaves.
Yeah, to a certain extent. Chattels, yes. And there may well have been a vibrant a culture amongst the women, but we don't know about it. Because this is
it's not recorded.
Well, it's not recorded, exactly. And we do know that if we go to other cultures where previously we just focus on the male culture, and then we've got records, and we find, you know, of the female culture in other cultures that actually there's a vibrant other culture going on, but we wouldn't know it because those records are gone. So yeah, it's kind of an unknown what was going on with women at the time. I mean, the significant women in the stories are the oracles and the prophets. They were mostly women. And then in the symposium, the peak of the symposium dialogue is Socrates recounting a discussion he had with this kind of semi-goddess woman who told him everything he needs to know about love, but she told him everything he needs to know about homoerotic love. So it's pretty weird.
Gwyneth, the body-soul thing reminds me of asceticism and particularly thinking in Christianity, where the higher order was celibacy, and the monks who tried to carry that out. To me, there seems to be linkage there with that that notion.
Yeah, certainly. This whole journey of detachment from the body and bodily pleasures towards this higher inner experience is very strong through Platonism and then in Christianity, yes. And a lot of that, you can see a direct line certainly in the mysticism within Christianity. You can see a direct line from Platonists. It's very clear. In fact, it's kind of hard to define where the Platonist teachers stop and the Christian teachers start, because some of them are ambiguously ambiguous in their Christianity. So yeah, that's a good point. But how does everyone feel about, like this hatred of the body stuff? I mean, it's pretty. It comes out pretty full on in this section, doesn't it?
Makes you feel like everything you do in life is pretty frivolous.
Yeah, and why is that? Because it's all about the sensible life and...
Yeah, I guess the pursuit of enlightenment should be number one for everyone. But, having fun or, connecting with people or being a valuable member of society just seems to be very low on the list of things that make you a good person.
But Socrates saw himself as being a contributor to his society, and there's this whole sense of trying to make your society better, which is an interesting link with some of the things that happen in some parts of the Western community now. And people trying to reform things. But there was an enormous sense I felt from Socrates that he was trying to make his society better.
Yes, I think so too. I'll just respond to Helen and Liv there, just to
Okay.
throw that back, Kathy. So the overriding project in the dialogues is to answer the question, what is the virtuous man or the virtuous person? And then as it goes through, we get to a point where Socrates says, early in the Republic, says, well, look, it's pretty clear you can't have a virtuous person without a society that fosters virtue. So then the discussion moves towards to say, well, what would be a good society? And then starts to describe a society that particularly involves good education and good institutions that support virtuous behavior and virtuous people and so on. So what's happening here, what happens there is that the idea is that what you have to do, or what some people have to do, the philosopher rulers, is they have to go up, if you like, and get the wisdom and then come back down into society and then run society, and then it'll be run in an ethical sort of way. So there is, to a certain extent in this dialogue and stuff, the religious rejection of the world. But there's a very important tenet all the way through Plato, where it's about going out and getting the wisdom and then coming back down. To use the metaphor of the cave, which I might have mentioned before, which is in the Republic, where people are sitting in a cave trapped, just looking at shadows reflected on a wall. And then the philosopher gets up, turns around, realizes that they're just shadows, and then goes out of the cave into the light of pure form. So there's this kind of journey, but the important thing is that they have to return. Society has allowed them to go out, and they've got to return and now rule with the wisdom that they learned there. So there's certainly ethical dimension to all this. Yes, sorry, Catherine.
I wanted to say that, I can't remember now how we got onto that topic, but it was a society that aspired for balance and order, but there was a lot of, they acknowledged their own if you like, predisposition to sort of live in excess. And balance and order and harmony was the highest goal of the art, in the arts, in aesthetics, in you know, sculpture and in architecture, and in it was what was considered beautiful. So there was wasn't there a lot of crazy things happening as well, like a lot of partying, a lot of you know, excess behavior, and they knew that that was their weakness. So when you talked about what did you say, the detachment of the body and the soul, so that was like the so you can understand then why they sort of aspired to that, to be able to detach, because they knew that they were very weak in some ways, you know. Do you understand what I'm saying? There's actually a quote actually in Greek that says "to miden agan," meaning "to miden agan." The goal was to, you know, I think that was to be moderate.
Yes.
To achieve moderation in life, you know. So, I mean, what is that correct? Is that correct, Bernie? I mean, at the time when this was written.
Yeah, I mean, this is okay. So what was happening? It was amongst this class of wealthy men in Athens and across the city-states. Yeah, there was the elites, the aristocratic, or even in the democracy, there were still elite families. The elites were very wealthy, and they were also generally, in one respect, idle. They didn't sort of have 9 to 5 jobs as we had. They would be investing, they would be, you know, engaging in business in all sorts of ways, but they had a lot of time, and they did indulge in pleasures, as we're seeing in the symposium, which is basically, a symposium is like a drinking party, which is more probably should be called an orgy, you know, like a drinking, eating, sexual orgy. Normal, but yes, there was a lot of that going on in sensual life and enjoying your riches and getting wealthier and wealthier and so on like that. And so, yeah, that's the context in which Plato is pushing people to say, well, look, you're not going, you know, by getting richer, by going to lots of symposiums, it's not going to make you happy in the long run, sort of thing, you know. The moderation thing is a particular theme of Aristotle, by the way. So I won't, yeah, that's particularly Aristotle. Plato is more this idea of detachment from the body. Okay, so yeah, I just say it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't enjoy bodily pleasures. It's, if you like, an attitude to it. It's that you're not invested in it in a way, you don't invest yourself in the way that you might if you weren't enlightened. Okay, anyone else got any comments?
I want to say on that, I guess, following from our discussion, I find the whole idea of a philosopher being half dead quite fascinating. It's both weird, you know, negative, and yet so positive, because it takes away the burden of worry of death. In a way, I guess it sort of makes you accept what is reality, I guess.
Well, it really does become the theme of this this dialogue. Yeah. I remember when we finished our last introduction on the last day, I was chatting with someone who was left behind, and we just decided, well, really, what is this dialogue all about? It's about coming to terms with mortality, coming to terms with your own death, and also coming to terms with your little deaths, of course, because we all have our little deaths, like losing our jobs, losing money, having a pleasure and then losing that pleasure. I mean, they're all little deaths in a way, aren't they? And so it really, as we'll go through it, we'll see that Samila's right. This is really what it's all about. And there's lots of things going on that theme, unresolved things, like the developing a fantasy that what might happen after death. Is it a fantasy or is it real? And what are the meaning of these proofs and everything when we're proving the immortality of the soul? So, you know, it's going to be really interesting when we get to all those and discuss them. Okay, anyone else?
So in our society, we have this capacity to think that we are immortal and not to really ever think about death. But in reality, life is a fatal disease.
Why do we have the capacity? I think I know what you're saying, but just tell me, why do you say we have the capacity not to think about death?
Because we don't talk about it, we don't face it, we don't see it. Socrates is sitting there and talking about it and facing it in a way that I think our society is many people in our society are incapable of doing.
Yeah, we have a cultural aversion to it, don't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think,
Can I say something, Felicity? Sorry. Yeah. Turn your mute off. Yeah.
Yeah. Just on that. So in yogic Buddhist philosophies and stuff like that, death is a really important thing, and it is focused on with that view of the only thing that you ever know is that you're going to die, but the idea of death is the death of the body, that the soul or the essence continues on to be reborn. So I found a lot of this actually very similar to Buddhist philosophy with that concept of reincarnation, because he talks about the body being reborn after death.
Yeah.
And coming back, which is actually, that's not going off to heaven and having a party up there, that's actually coming back in reincarnation.
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
it's the soul, not the body, isn't
it? The soul, the idea is the soul doesn't die, and that the soul is reincarnated in other bodies. Yeah, we'll get to that as we go along. And yes, certainly, Felicity, there are extraordinary similarities with.
And certainly with training I've had has been very much about that. Living a yogic life is about non-attachment. So while you can have nice things and enjoy and have fun time and live in society and stuff like that, there's not that attachment to it. So if something comes, something goes, enjoy it while it's there and let it go on its way and making way for the new. So there's that non-attachment to things.
Yeah, and that's pretty clear already in the dialogue, isn't it? That's what he's trying to say, and it kind of makes sense. You know, it's that idea that if you're living fully within your ego self, within your self-esteem, you know, who you are in society, and you know what makes you important and all that sort of thing. It's difficult to die because you're invested in all that. Whereas if you have all that, but your center is at a more detached level, then death is easier, whether or not there is this story or belief in immortality or in reincarnation. Yeah.
So it was very interesting for me when I walked into the lab where we had to, where all the cadavers were, and we had to dissect them and things, to have that sort of experience of what's the difference between me and this body that is lying here that was a human being just like me. was a very, it
Oh,
was,
sorry, I certainly had the same experience myself doing that myself. And I do remember that the only thing I couldn't do, strangely enough, was fingers, because they just felt too human. Yeah, which is, yeah. No, that's right. You know, like when you're exposed to the body, and I mean, that gets back to what you were saying earlier, Libby, about our lack of exposure to death. It's in so many ways, but, you know, most of us don't see dead people very often and don't see death very often. It tends to be hidden from us. But also there's the other thing, like, for example, if you look back through even like 2 generations back and then go all the way back to the generations, the chances of you burying a child was very high, whether it was a young child or whether it was a stillborn child, whether it was a young child, or whether it was a son or daughter dying in war. Whereas today, people that it's unusual to experience that trauma. And so there's a lot of traumas around death that, and there's also a certain predictability to our life that other people didn't have, where, you know, I mean, these plagues come along and you know, it is a big thing, but it doesn't hit you the way that those plagues in the Middle Ages hit you, you know, and hit societies and absolutely terrified everyone. So, yeah, so it is different for us now, I think. But I wonder how that relates to reading Plato. Okay, has anyone got any more comments about that, the theme of death or the detachment from the body? How are you going there, Yanni? Have you got any questions about that?
It is certainly a lot of information, and for me to catch up with the group, I need to do my reading, which I haven't yet.
Okay.
And I missed the last class, but David has now given me the link. So hopefully, you know, we'll catch up next week with everything that, you know, the Platonism and the skeptical philosophy is about.
Sure. Okay, that's great. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but yeah, no worries. We can catch up next week. Now, look, I thought maybe we could have a bit of a look at some of the affinities in this dialogue already with Christianity. Does anyone? I mean, Gwen's already raised some stuff already, and I just wonder if anyone else wants to bring up anything else that they can see where there are some similarities with the Christian religion and the story of Jesus.
I thought it was interesting, the statement there, about the soul's immortality informed Christianity on a topic found deficient in the Bible. So Socrates, I mean, if that relates to what Socrates, if we're still talking about Socrates, that would have been more applicable. Well, it would have been the Hebrew scriptures, wouldn't it, in those, the Old Testament.
Oh, okay. So no, what I was saying there, and you'll see this as you come along through the dialogue, that there's a lot of talk about the immortality of the soul and what happens in the afterlife, including reward and punishment. That is, someone's got a bit of static in the background. I'm not sure whether that's you, Gwen. It's finding it hard to concentrate. That's better, yeah. Yep. Yeah, a lot of this story about the stories about the afterlife and what happens in the afterlife have very strong affinities with Christian stories of the afterlife, as we will see as we go through. That's what that was referring to. Another interesting parallel is consider the founders of a religion or a philosophical tradition who were killed by the state. You know, can we think of any others, founders of a tradition that were killed by the state? Socrates was killed by the state, and of course Jesus was killed by the state. So that's kind of an interesting parallel, and it helps people bring Platonism. That helps people bring Platonism and the story of Socrates to the Christian story of Jesus. Can anyone think of anything?
Well, I just found it really interesting how much they were debating this whole idea of souls and immortality, and how important it was in that debate, and how sure that Socrates, well, in this story, was about his coming death within that day, and his really secure sense of immortality. Yeah, and I was thinking this week too about that concept of Socrates being killed by the state, and somebody like Jesus being talking about immortality and being killed by the state, and that whole sort of Christian idea about immortality.
Because it's a terrible thing to happen to your leader. If we see Socrates as the leader, and I suppose he's put up there by Plato in the early dialogues, that, and same with Jesus too. I mean, you following this great person, and then suddenly they're killed. It's gone. And you know, I'm thinking of the Gospel of Mark, where there's no resurrection, you know, at the end. I mean, it just ends in this utter devastation, you know. So that's a kind of interesting thing. But also, one thing that I find really powerful is this kind of appearance of almost like a suicide cult that is cut short. Like, it's like, wow, you know, as soon as you can get rid of the body, the better. So as soon as you can die, the better. You're just waiting for some beneficiary to actually do the deed for you. And if people know much about early Christianity, there's a very strong martyr cult there. Now, there's extremes on this that I don't want to go to. The first thing is that Christians were persecuted. They were persecuted, and they were persecuted a lot, but not all the time. And the other thing is that some were unwilling martyrs, but there were people who were willing martyrs. And there was a cult amongst early Christians to be martyred. So I kind of see that when we're reading this particular section, which is kind of quite bleak, it's saying, you know, like, even as you've got to follow me as soon as you can, and we've got to wait until someone kills you, but because the gods don't like it if you kill yourself. But yeah, yeah. I find that really striking and quite alarming.
I can't remember, but did they say why the gods don't like it if you kill yourself?
It's because to me it was because you were meant to be following the gods and following what the gods were expecting you to do. And if you went off and killed yourself, you were cutting right across that whole sort of concept. And it's really interesting that whole feeling about suicide is ingrained, being the wrong thing to do is so ingrained in that culture, and that has passed through into our culture as well. So yeah, there's a whole movement at the moment, I think, to try and better understand what suicide's about, but that it's such a terrible and shameful thing to do.
Yes, and in the religion I grew up with when I was young, it was a very grave sin to commit suicide, and if it was admitted that you did commit suicide, it was usually covered up. Then you were not allowed to have a funeral. And so the first funerals for Catholics in Australia for people who were known suicides, you know, were administered by Lionel Murphy's celebrants were the first to do that, because there was this, because you see there's this double teaching, right? It's like heaven's this great place, right? And so why don't you just get there as soon as you can? And they say, well, hang on a minute, you know, we can't let everyone just start killing themselves. And this was a problem in the early church with the martyrs, it seems. If you read some of the writings, there was a problem in the early church of too many people wanting to race out there and martyr themselves. Oh, this is getting rather bleak, isn't it? Should we go on to some other stuff? What have I said? I don't know whether I've said much about the mystery cult. Says, is anyone interested in that kind of background? Yeah, so there were these cults. We don't really know much about them because they were secretive. Much later on, people did write accounts of what went on, but it was, so there were the Orphic mysteries and the Eleusinian mysteries, and some others as well. They were the big ones. And so you would go away for a few days, and you would go through certain rites, and it seemed that it involved going into caves and seeing bright lights and all sorts of things going on. But you would come out the other side with this, with being initiated into the mysteries. So being initiated into these hidden truths that ordinary people who didn't go through these mysteries had access to. And if you'd done the mystery, it's kind of like, I suppose, like doing the Hajj in Islam or something, but you know, not like that, because it was like, if you had done it, you were a special person and you were kind of in that cult for life. And there was like a bondage between people who had followed the various mysteries. And so another interesting thing about it is when people describe Pythagoreanism much later, so that was a cult before Plato. So they went over to the heel of Italy and set up their commune there. They were vegetarians, they didn't eat beans, they had all these weird things. But whenever people describe Pythagoreanism and their beliefs and their practices and everything, it's got a very strong correspondence with the Orphic mysteries. So there seemed to be a strong association between Pythagoreanism, which Plato was into, and the Orphic stuff. And as I said earlier, there's a sense in Plato that what he's doing is he's saying, well, okay, I can give you access to these mysteries, to this higher enlightenment, but via a different method. And his method is the method of dialogue, the method of dialectic, he calls it, or logos, and also by using a myth, because he uses quite a bit of myth, and we'll come up with some myth as we go along through this dialogue.
So was it like a crash course in philosophy or enlightenment, these, like, you know, cave ritual things? Like, would you come out of it at the level of Plato?
Look, yeah, well, that's the idea, but it's not like doing a crash course. You know, like, just be careful with that word crash course. I think you've got to think a bit more like some of those cults, hippie cults in the 60s and the 70s. You know, it was much more like a total experience. and where and an unreal experience, and jolting you out of your normal way of seeing and getting you into a new way of seeing. And then at the end, they do something special and you're enlightened. So it's much more full on than, I know it's probably not what you meant, but it's much more full on than just saying a crash course. Yeah, it was very cultish cults.
It kind of doesn't seem very Greek. It's weird. Yeah.
Why not very Greek?
I don't know. I just feel like the Greeks are kind of known for not for this kind of hippie ritual stuff.
Well, it was a long time ago, wasn't it?
Yeah. There were actually there was a lot of that going on. Actually, if you which, you know, I can't
like
remember.
The Delphic Oracle, I think, is sort of where my head's at with that. But yeah, I kind of I never really thought of it as sort of like a philosophical kind of thing. It was more like, let's get high and try and think of things.
Well, if you watch read some of the plays, or attend, you know, Medea, or, you know, Iphigenia, or, you know, any of those. No, I don't know what era, on the timeline where they on the historical timeline context where they sort of are placed, according to Plato. There was actually quite a bit of that, I think, happening.
Yeah, and we've got to remember, they had a very strong, you know, I've got to be careful with my words, but let me use my words liberally. Imaginary life, you know, and imaginary life through their gods and the stories about their gods and everything. So they had, you know, and their plays express this, and their poems express that, and it's a very strong and rich imaginary life going on there, which leads me also to you know, I think something Libby brought up in terms of surprise about them talking about immortality and stuff. It's probably worth mentioning what else came before. So the mystery cults, it looks like, with Plato, he's drawing his ideas of the afterlife from that direction. But then there's the background beyond that, because there's people have probably heard of Hades, and the idea of the underworld and going into the underworld in an afterlife. So there are all those stories around that. Now, Plato, the mystery cults maybe, and Plato, the way it's different, I suppose, is this kind of higher, more formal, if you like, if formal is the right word, more mathematical notion of the higher level. And it was higher with Plato. It wasn't going underneath. There was a sense of ascending to the gods. The gods were above, but ascending to the gods. So this notion of, in the afterlife, going up to heaven, or during your life, actually ascending on the steps towards that level before you die, is distinctively Plato. And that did go through to Christianity as well.
But also, in terms of these mystics and cults and things, there's a need within us as humans to belong to something, and belonging, and this sense of cult and being included and in the inner circle and belonging is something that does appeal to certain certain groups within our society, and continues to do that. We continue to have cults and groups within our society.
That's right. It's like the psychosocial need for belonging is expressed there in religions. Is that kind of what you're saying, Libby?
I was saying that it was expressed for some people within belonging to a cult, in belonging, being in the inner, like in the inner group.
Right, okay, but also belonging to a church maybe as well, or just a cult?
I was talking more about cults, I think.
Yeah.
So why do why did people then, and why do people still, seek to belong to a cult? I think that's, although some cults are religious cults, other cults are not. It's, yeah, I think, I don't think that's the same as having a religious belief, no.
Okay, okay, all right. So before I start chatting about what we're up to on next week, has anyone got any further questions or comments about today's reading, the journey of the soul?
Yeah, I have. I think it's quite astonishing the degree of certainty about the immortality and the afterlife. There seems little room for doubt. What do you think?
Well, the thing is that this dialogue has a strong dynamic to it, and what actually happens is that the certainty is cut down in the reading after next. So the week after next, that certainty is cut down and has to be built up again. So let's not anticipate what's going to happen in this dialogue and what the conclusions, the nature of the conclusions, because it gets interesting. So let's hold ourselves in doubt. Okay, so next week we continue with the Phaedo, and we called this week The Other Side of Things. This is where we go a bit deeper into the form. So we've already said there's a form of justice and injustice, there's a form of beauty and ugliness, and we talked about pleasure and pain and all that. And so we're going to go a bit deeper into the formal nature of the forms and Plato's doctrine of generation by alternation of opposites. And then another big aspect of next week's reading is the introduction of Plato's notion of learning as remembering what we already knew at our birth. And so this is about when we have our sensible experience, we become aware or learn the forms that we already knew. What the hell does that mean? And there's a particular section, and pay attention for it, on this topic to do with like and unlike, and then it moves to equality and inequality. So remember I said in an earlier, I think last week, I said, let's go to something, we go to justice, let's go to something like equality. Equality in the general sense, like this amount of money is equal to that, or unequal, or this weight is unequal to that, or the temperature is unequal, or equality in society, whatever else. The form of actually equality itself, can you define that? So something to think about when you're reading, and so this will get us further into what the forms are, which is supposed to be the essence of all reality. Okay, so has anyone got any final questions before we finish up for the night? Okay, well, enjoy your reading, and I think it's almost directly follows on from the previous reading. Yeah, so enjoy that, and we'll see everyone this time next week. So thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.